Winters used to be terrifying. Not the kind where your phone runs out of battery halfway down a ski slope and you have to make small talk in a gondola. I'm talking about the kind of winters that formed entire mythologies, toppled empires, and made porridge a luxury worth stealing for. You see, before central heating made frostbite a mere inconvenience and hot cocoa a lifestyle brand, winter was a formidable annual guest with very specific demands. Your crops, your livestock, and ideally 3 pairs of socks made from the family sheep. The ancient world wasn't so much prepared for winter as it was quietly praying it remembered to dry enough firewood. Let's drift back gently, like lying down in a snowbank made of wool. It's somewhere around the 3rd century CE, and you're living in a stone hut in northern Europe. The walls are thick, but the wind whistles through them like a bored bard with a flute addiction. You've got one fireplace, small, smoky, squabbling with the laws of physics, and you're hoping the peat won't smother your lungs before it warms your toes. Now imagine winter moving in around late October. The harvest, if you could call it that, was a collection of turnips with abandonment issues. The salted meats are hanging in the rafters, dripping steadily onto someone's sleeping mat. Everyone's decided it's a good time to start knitting, telling stories, or panicking quietly in the corner. The danger of winter, historically, wasn't just the cold, nor the nutritional calamity of trying to survive 5 months on boiled cabbage and old dreams. It was the stillness. Crops halted, travel impossible, armies disbanded, not because of treaties, but because nobody wanted to sword fight on icy roads, which truly is a reasonable boundary. But of course, Mother Nature had a flair for the dramatic. Take the Great Frost of 1709. Temperatures dropped so far in Europe that birds reportedly froze mid-flight and shattered upon landing, though, let's be honest, that story may have been given a little extra chili pepper by 18th century embellishers. But frostbite, very real. Wine, froze in the barrels. Bread, came with a crunch so aggressive it lost 2 teeth in a peasant's mouth. This frost even delayed battles in the War of the Spanish Succession. No one was in the mood to fight when cannons froze to the ground and horses simply refused to participate. Understandably. For thousands of years, people met winter like a yearly apocalypse, only with less fire and more damp socks. Consider medieval England, where chimneys were a privilege and beds closer resembled haystack sandwiches. The idea of layering up was alive and well, except that all layering materials tended to smell vaguely of goat. Of course, you had your winter coping mechanisms. The Anglo-Saxons championed winter feasts, which were basically survival parties. Invitations optional and menus consisting mainly of anything edible that hadn't gone moldy, including but not limited to mystery stew. Wine and mead helped dull the edges, and storytelling kept minds distracted, because there's nothing like pretending a singing elf solved your housing problems. Even the language we use hints at winter's grip. The word February, for instance, comes from the Latin februa, meaning purification, because of the ritual cleaning done at winter's end. But let's be honest, it was less about spiritual hygiene and more about washing off 5 months of lard smoke and low expectations. And yet, somehow, humans endured. Huddled in smoky halls, bundled into furs that once belonged to less fortunate woodland creatures, folks would pass winter by cataloguing their blisters, inventing new saints to pray to, or recalling warmer days with the kind of wistful detail you'd expect from a love letter. Some grew clever. The Norse built long houses with communal hearths, where whole families and their chickens slept together for warmth. Romans, ever the engineers, perfected underfloor heating called hypercourse in their villas, though unfortunately it only really benefited the rich or anyone who could convincingly pass as a toga repairman. Still, the chill unified people. Winter was the great equalizer, a time when kings, peasants, and opportunistic raccoons all ventured inside to share warmth, food, and the occasional flea. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, let's gently close the door to this frosty little corner of history and tuck yourself tighter beneath your blanket. Because far from being over, winter still has its whispers left to unfold. As the first breath of winter slipped across the landscape, soft as a sigh from an ice giant who'd been holding its breath since July, villages across the ancient world pulled their wool cloaks tighter and braced for the long, frigid siege. You see, winter in early history wasn't the charming postcard season we picture, with mittens and mugs of hot chocolate. It was more like nature tapping humanity on the shoulder and whispering, "I hope you've stored enough turnips, because I'm about to try and kill you." Our ancestors, bless their woolen socks and frostbitten optimism, didn't have thermostats, double-glazed windows, or even a reliable weather forecast. Just an ache in the knees, and maybe a chicken that refused to lay eggs exactly one day before the first blizzard. These were the early meteorologists, grumpy livestock and aching joints. To them, winter wasn't just a season, but an annual suspense thriller, where the villains were frostbite, starvation, and that one neighbor who definitely ate the winter wheat in September claiming, "I thought it was barley." There were no supermarkets to dash into when the cupboard was bare, just snowdrifts, icy silence, and perhaps a squirrel who refused to befriend you. In medieval Europe, for instance, winter meant a time of reckoning. All the harvests, all the haystack stuffing, pickling, curing, salting, drying, and that one guy in the village who always talked about building a root cellar but never got around to it. This was when it all mattered. If you'd prepared, winter was tolerable. Not pleasant, mind you, but survivable. If not, well, you might end up gnawing on boiled shoe leather and bargaining with a rat for the last chestnut by Candlemas. Even the mightiest castles couldn't keep out the cold. Stone is famously bad at cuddling. Lords and ladies wrapped themselves in layers of linen, wool, and whatever dignity they had left after realizing they could see their breath indoors. Some used warmed stones, or even slept with small dogs under the covers. Not for affection, but for heat. The original hot dog. Meanwhile, in the lowly peasant, cottages, which were often not much more than a roof, balanced over branches with smoke-filtered optimism. Families huddled together like particularly chilly firewood. People slept packed tightly, not for space saving, but for warmth. It was like ancient Airbnb, but all the guests were relatives and no one remembered who invited Great Uncle Alric. There was a practice called bed sharing, not for romance, but for efficiency. You might find yourself nose to nose with a cousin, a goat, or someone who talked in their sleep about last summer's beats. Whatever kept you warm. Food was another matter. A summer of bad crops meant a winter of inventive cuisine. Porridge, and we use that word generously, could be made of oats, peas, dried beans, or anything vaguely edible. Some recipes from the colder months read less like menus and more like botanical scavenger hunts. Lichen, squirrel marrow, shoe sole stew. A highlight was bread, made from ground bark mixed with a little grain, then baked until it felt like a roof tile and tasted only slightly better. And as if hunger and cold weren't festive enough, there was the ever-looming threat of illness. Winters bred sickness the way medieval cooks bred errors in hygiene. Poor ventilation, close quarters, and a rudimentary grasp of germ theory meant that once one member of the household got sniffly, the rest would soon follow. A single sneeze in a hut could light off a symphonic coughing session that echoed through the walls like a sad attempt at harmony. Even the animals felt it. Chickens sulked, cows produced less milk, and if your horse got sick, well, let's just say it wouldn't be pulling any sleighs through the snow. More likely, it'd be adding to that bark bread in a way nobody liked to discuss before dinner. But not all was bleak. In the thickest snow, communities did something shocking. They helped each other. Villages would share food, warmth, and stories. People sang songs not to celebrate winter, but to outlast it. Folklore bloomed like frost patterns on windows. Tales of Jack Frost, the Snow Queen, or mysterious creatures who lived just beneath the ice and nibbled toes if you didn't keep them warm. Science has since confirmed this one as frostbite, not elf bites. So winter, for all its freezing fingers, had a way of drawing people closer. Huddled together, surrounded by stories and stew that may or may not contain shoe leather, they endured. Not because winter was kind, but because people learned how to be kind enough to outlast it. And from those flickers of shared warmth, a quiet resilience was born. One that clasped torches, told tales, and waited patiently for spring's shy return. As the snow deepens and the moon floats quietly above frost-laced thatched roofs, let's linger a little longer, just on the cusp of another night, where firelight flickers, and shadows in the snow carry whispers from the past. There is a particular silence that only winter understands. Long before thermostats and central heating, before the humble miracle of wool blend socks and reliable roofing, winter's silence was a warning. As the last of autumn's warmth tiptoed away, people across early history braced themselves with a mingling of dread and mild, regionally specific panic. In medieval Europe, for example, winter was not a cheery season of scarves, cocoa, and awkward family photos. No, winter was more like a siege without an end date, commanded by an army of ice, darkness, and respiratory disorders. Harvest season was a kind of frantic grocery run, except your grocery store was a lord's field, and your receipt was written with blisters and back pain. Once the crops were in, the root vegetables hung, and the last rebellious goose had been chased into a pen. It was time to lock the doors, say a prayer, and prepare for a few months of huddling by the hearth, wondering if your pickled cabbage would last longer than your Uncle Osric's patience. Fun fact, in some communities, winter was so tightly associated with food anxiety that they had actual feast days to mark the beginning of the Great Preserving. These weren't joyful potlucks. These were calculated goodbye parties for things like fresh dairy. Farewell, sweet cream, they'd sigh dramatically on December the 2nd. For we shall not dine upon thee until the thaw. Who needs Netflix when you've got tragedy in a butter churn? And about that hearth, the centre of winter survival, it was both lifeline and lung hazard. Fireplaces were a smoky kind of gamble, where ventilation was a suggestion and carbon monoxide an unknown but very present roommate. The lucky households had chimneys. The less lucky had smoke-blackened rafters and a persistent cough, dubbed by some as the ash wheeze, a term that sounds poetic until you've experienced it firsthand during a particularly intimate dinner of boiled rutabaga. Clothing, too, played its part in this icy theatre of discomfort. Before zippers and thermal underwear, layers upon layers were the basic defense. A nobleman in winter could resemble a depressed onion. Silk under tunic, padded doublet, fur-trimmed mantle, and possibly a small child hiding under it all for warmth. Peasants did the same, but with more wool and fewer fashion choices. And yes, let's talk about wool. Itchy, damp-loving, always-watching wool. The fabric equivalent of a well-meaning aunt who just will not stop hugging you. Many folks also took to bed, not for comfort, but because beds were legitimately warmer than standing around. In the chillier extremes of Europe, entire families would climb under a pile of blankets and call it winter. This was known affectionately, or perhaps despairingly, as bed sharing. If you were lucky, there'd be a bed warmer. A brass pan filled with hot coals slipped under the sheets before bedtime. If you were unlucky, you'd forget to remove it and awaken to both literal and metaphorical hot mess. With food uncertain and warmth fleeting, people's schedules began taking on curious shapes. Nights felt longer, probably because they were, and days were little blinks of grey light between dawn and dusk. Candlelight was precious, and not everyone could afford to burn hours' worth of tallow unless you fancied your living room smelling like roasted mutton and an existential crisis. Even crime went into hibernation. Most marauders, burglars, and travelling bandits agreed, if somewhat implicitly, that winter was frankly too much work. Roads were impassable, swords got stuck in their sheaths, and frostbite rather ruined the dramatic flair of a good old-fashioned ambush. But above all, it was illness that loomed largest in the wintry dark. With bodies weakened by bad nutrition and close quarters, fevers had the perfect stage. No one had quite figured out germs yet, but they had noticed that hugging your feverish nephew was a suspiciously efficient way to get your own lingering cough. The common cold was not called common for nothing, and remedies ranged from drink elderberry wine to pray quietly and hope. Bed rest was prescribed liberally, particularly when the bed was one of the few warm places left in the house. And so, winter in early history became not just a season, but a test, a time when endurance was measured in loaves of bread, lengths of firewood, and the grit with which one greeted the frost creep of dawn through a cracked window pane. The snow, falling like quiet punctuation, signaled both beauty and a very cold reminder that nature is only charming until your soup freezes mid-spoon. The winter would continue to test the human spirit with challenges both physical and, curiously often, culinary. Because when faced with the bitter cold, some people ate their boots, but perhaps that peculiar tale is best left for a bit later on, as the wind grows slower and the fire whispers just a touch warmer. Snowflakes fell like lazy thoughts from the sky, drifting down in clusters, each one attempting a silent revolution against roofs, cloaks, and exposed noses. Winter, for the average medieval villager, wasn't just a season, it was a siege. A quiet, cold siege that didn't bother with battering rams or flaming arrows, but preferred to starve you out, freeze you slowly, and let your candle supply dwindle dramatically by mid-February. Food, of course, was the most immediate issue. The pantry, or its 10th century peasant equivalent, which might have doubled as a wooden chest that also supported your sleeping goat, was stocked in the fall with whatever root vegetables were willing to rot the slowest. Turnips, for instance, nature's practical joke. They kept a while, unfortunately. Beans and salted meat were prized, but only if your family was lucky enough to have animals worth salting, or if you hadn't already celebrated November by curing everything, edible in sight, including that one cousin's suspiciously slow-moving pet pig. Preserving food became a sacred winter prep ritual. smoking, drying, salting, all noble arts that essentially involve denying food all forms of pleasure. No moisture, no warmth, not even decent daylight. Cheese, with proper care, would harden to something approximating medieval armor, and black bread could double as a blunt weapon if dinner conversation took a controversial turn. But by January, the larder grew dismal. The salted pork developed a taste only describable as historic, and the last of the onions had gone full abstract expressionist. Many families invented meals, or at least heavily performed them, by pouring hot water over stale grains and whispering encouraging things. Occasionally, pine bark soup made a reappearance, proving that people can call just about anything a broth if they're cold enough. And speaking of cold, clothing. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate the agony of medieval layering. Without mass-produced textiles or decent insulation, folks wrapped themselves in whatever they could stitch, shear, or steal. Wool was life. It was spun with such reverence that it almost reached the status of religious iconography once December rolled around. Undergarments were minimal, often non-existent for the lower classes, which was unfortunate positioning when wind decided to introduce itself. Shoes had about as much winterproofing as a damp sponge. So many went shoeless, trusting hardened soles and sheer optimism to defeat frostbite. The elite, of course, had furs, luxuriously lined cloaks adorned with the spirits of unfortunate animals. But even they weren't invincible against the northern winds that swept through coal-stone halls like gossip. Then there was the fire. Fire, the holy hearth, the benevolent tyrant of the medieval home. It radiated heat so long as someone fed it, almost constantly, with wood that had ideally been split and stacked before the snows. If you waited too long, chopping frozen logs became something between a punishment and a sport. The hearth sat in the middle of the home, blazing away, warming the core of the cottage, while the corners remained roughly the temperature of the moon. Entire families huddled close together at night, not for affection, necessarily, but for survival. It was a communal thawing experience and a prime opportunity for lice to explore new real estate. Outside, forget it. Travel was treacherous. Roads, if they could be called that, turned to ice rinks or sank under snowdrifts. Horses lost their footing, carts got stuck, and heaven help you if your job was a messenger. History doesn't always mention the poor soul trudging across 5 leagues of sleet just to deliver a wax-sealed note reading, "Don't forget extra candles." Illness, naturally, used winter like a theatre stage. Cold air wafting through unsealed gaps in dwellings practically invited coughs, colds, and assorted lung-based dilemmas. Fevers came and went, along with the local healer's bewildering assortment of poultices, many of which involved garlic, ale, and an unwavering belief in the moon's opinion on phlegm. And yet, despite all this cursing and chattering and praying for springing, people endured. They sang to keep spirits up. They told stories around fireplaces, exaggerated into full-blown sagas by the third retelling. They brewed weak ale, stronger ale, and then lied about which one was better. Children played with bones and sticks, as one does when all the exciting toys are also potential kindling. Somehow, the dark months passed, slowly, like molasses taking a nap. And as ice crackled on the rooftops and the moon hung high over windswept fields, villagers continued their strange, stubborn customs, sleeping in shifts, dreaming under straw-thatched roofs, and listening for whatever wild creature howled next beyond the margins of their safe, smoky rooms. Of course not. All dangers in winter came down from the sky. or up through empty larders. Sometimes the threats crept in quietly, on 4 legs, or sometimes just 2. But that's another tale to warm your feet by. In the waning light of ancient December, with the sun low and sulky on the horizon, like a candle nearly out of breath, let us now wander softly into the woolen world of medieval layering. More art than science, and most definitely a necessity. Winters before the invention of central heating, or socks that matched, demanded a wardrobe strategy somewhere between Eskimo and Netflix binge. Early people learned quite quickly that it wasn't enough to simply put on a tunic and call it a season. No, dressing for winter was a frigid game of survival, and losing it could mean joining the rather exclusive club known as Year Icy Doom. Imagine, if you will, an Anglo-Saxon farmer in the 9th century, somewhere in what is now gloriously damp England. He wakes up in his wattle and daub home, which offers approximately the same insulation as a soggy biscuit. His breath puffs visibly in the air, forming tiny clouds of regret that he's still alive this morning and must now get out from under his animal skin-covered bed. He won't be slipping on a sweater. No, he'll wrap himself layer by layer in woolen tunics, linen undergarments, and possibly a second-hand bearskin that previous generations referred to only as Uncle Olaf. Then comes the cloak, always the cloak, with a fibula brooch the size of a beef pie, because fastening one's outerwear with style should never be sacrificed, even when your toes have decided to strike out on their own in search of warmth. Medieval folk took ingenuity to new heights in their pursuit of not freezing. They stuffed shoes with hay, wore mittens stitched from whatever animal part wasn't currently being eaten, and lined cloaks with fur borrowed, presumably without legal documentation, from forest creatures. Some monasteries even issued thermal underwear in the form of heavy linen breeches, thoughtfully shared among multiple monks. The ick factor was high, but so was the hypothermia rate. Priorities. And still, cold seeped into bones like water into old boots. Frostbite was less of a possibility and more of a seasonal ritual. It was almost fashionable, really. Oh, dear Oswin lost another toe this week. Blessed be. Of course, toes were like medieval car keys. People lost them a lot, didn't often find them again, and somehow just learned to get by. In the castles of the somewhat wealthy, the situation improved. Marginally. It is a myth that stone walls and lofty towers made for cozy living. Emerging from a medieval tower bedroom in winter was a bit like coming out of a meat freezer and walking directly into a howling wind tunnel. Noble lords swaddled themselves in layers of fur-trimmed robes, sometimes donning what can only be described as 4-poster bed-length nightcaps. Think of the kind you'd see on A Dickens Ghost, but with more ermine lining and unresolved class issues. To heat these drafty abodes, fires roared in enormous stone hearths, which were essentially indoor bonfires with a tenancy agreement. Despite their size, the warmth was tragically local, refusing to travel more than 5 feet, with the rest of the room maintaining temperatures suitable for aging cheese. And yet, there was one mysterious medieval invention that brought warmth, both physical and emotional, to the icy gloom: the bed warmer. A charming contraption resembling a frying pan on a stick, it was filled with hot coals and tucked under bed linens like a toasty secret. Of course, it occasionally set fire to said linens, which led to some awkward conversations with the local abbey insurance providers, aka prayers. Beneath the covers, people shared not just warmth but also lice, folklore, and occasionally a reminder that bathing hadn't caught on yet. Entire families, dogs included, huddled together in sleep, welded by the cold into one vaguely fragrant, snuffling superorganism. But for those without hearths or hay-stuffed shoes, the drifters, the poor, the wandering monks with no cloister to call home, winter was merciless. Many early cities and towns enacted laws that required citizens to take in the needy on snowy nights, not out of charity, but simply because their frozen bodies would otherwise ruin the aesthetic of the morning streets. Yes, history humbles us. While today we debate the merits of heated car seats, our ancestors debated whether frostbitten fingers could be chewed as a protein source. Their fashion was functional, their methods primitive but fiercely inventive, and their shared suffering built communities stronger than ice. Which brings us to the next frosted corner of human resilience, when warmth wasn't just something to wear or lose, but something to ration. A time when fuel became treasure, and firewood caused more arguments than politics and berry pie combined. As winter's breath deepened across the ancient world, snow wasn't just a scenic inconvenience. It was often a punctuation mark at the end of a very short sentence, particularly for medieval peasants, whose winter fashion sense relied less on choice and more on whatever smelt less like turnips. But let's leave the frostbitten toes of the European countryside for a moment and take a meandering, snow-dusted stroll eastward to the lands of ancient China. Now, ancient China was both a bastion of innovation and, ironically, a place that still fought frost with fur and sheer stubbornness. While the emperors resided in relatively well-heated palace complexes, heated, that is, if you consider not freezing to death a form of luxury, the majority of the population had to get creative with the cold. Picture this: a farmer in the Han Dynasty, wrapped in 15 layers of homespun hemp, squatting near a kang. Ah yes, the kang. Not a marsupial or mischievous spirit, but rather an early Chinese form of central heating. It was a low, brick sleeping platform with a fire channel running beneath it. You heat it once, and the warmth slowly, deliciously radiates upward through your chilly sleeping mat, cocooning you like a toasted dumpling. Entire families would sleep shoulder to shoulder on the kang, which, besides warding off hypothermia, neatly solved your daily human contact quota. For those not privileged enough to have a kang, or rather, for those living outside northern China, where kangs were common, other techniques arose. Clay hand warmers, elegantly shaped and tucked into sleeves, were the unsung heroes of surviving poetry readings and bureaucratic tedium. These miniature fireboxes were filled with hot coals and wielded by scholars, merchants, and, presumably, anyone trying to fend off frostbite while keeping both hands for scrolls. Still, no matter how many hand warmers smouldered or how many scalded toes suffered for warmth, the big issue loomed: food. Chinese winters, with their frigid monsoonal tantrums, could shrivel a bowl of bok choy within seconds. Agricultural rhythms paused, markets dried up, and rice bowls began to echo. So came the great solution: pickling. You see, humanity has no problem with syllables like botulism or fermentation. When the alternative is starving before the Lunar New Year, entire villages would band together in late autumn to preserve mountains of Napa cabbage into kimchi-esque glory. Spices, garlic, chili. If it grew, it probably ended up in a jar with vinegar and a prayer. These fermented lifelines were stored underground or in jars sealed with waxed paper and hope. During long, snow-heavy weeks when nothing bore fruit but cabin fever, these pickled reserves kept bodies nourished and family arguments spicy. Even emperors, for whom having food was rarely a problem, were wary of the cold. Imperial court records from the Tang dynasty mention that officials would schedule fewer meetings during winter, not out of courtesy, but because quills froze, noses dripped distractingly onto scrolls, and silk robes, however gorgeous, offered roughly the same insulation as a whisper. And let us not forget the ever-important winter festivals, because if you must endure weeks of blizzards and bleakness, surely there's something to be said for turning misery into merriment. The Lantern Festival, falling just at the tail end of winter, was a beacon of colour, song, and probably mild frostbite. Children dashed about under candlelit creations, hands shoved in sleeves, dreaming of spring. But where winter brought ice and hardship, it also brought a curious camaraderie, shared warmth, shared meals, and shared complaints about nose icicles. Whether huddled on a kang, sipping hot millet porridge, or braving outdoor latrines with unshakable bravery, the people of ancient China didn't merely endure the winter, they seasoned it with resilience and a dash of pickled radish. Let us now drift gently, like flakes settling on a pagoda roof, to another corner of the world where warmth was less about ingenuity and more about survival by sheer fur. In the soft, hissing silence of winter woods, long before street lamps and snowplows, something peculiar drifted through the frosty air. Not just the cold, but the palpable tension of survival. Because for all its glistening charm, winter was, historically speaking, nature's least neighbourly season. And if you happened to be a humble peasant in, say, 14th century Europe, you'd know that the seemingly innocent icicles dangling from your roof were little fangs of seasonal judgment, glistening in sarcasm. By the time winter rolled around, the average medieval village was already low on options and slower to blink. Wheat, stored since August. Turnips, getting wrinkly. Fermentation was less a choice and more an existential coping mechanism. Water froze. Wine didn't. You can bet which got more popular. But the real drama happened not in the biting wind outside, nor in the frozen wells or cracked cartwheels, but in the kitchens, or, as they were often known, singular hearths shared by entire families, goats, and occasionally a confused chicken. The hearth fire was the medieval soul of warmth, hope, and soup. It required constant feeding, which meant trips into the woods for firewood. Where the snow was deep, the wolves were curious, and the frostbite was non-negotiable. And if you managed to drag back a bundle of semi-dry branches larger than a basket of grudges, congratulations. You'd earned another day of tepid stew and smoky eye contact. Now, let us take a dreamy detour to the Swedish countryside of the early 1700s, where the frigid bite of winter could literally trap entire households indoors for weeks. Not out of a dreamy hygge-induced hibernation, mind you, but because opening the door was genuinely impossible. When snowdrifts piled high enough to block entrances, you just stayed put. Days blurred together, filled with quiet churns of porridge, the whittling of awkward spoons, and anxiety over whether the cow would stop producing milk before spring, or worse, start talking. Oh yes, livestock in winter became somewhat of a conversational equal. Cooped up together for warmth, survival stripped away the hierarchy. You weren't just a farmer. You and your sheep were roommates, and your goat had opinions. But even the nobility, wrapped in their embroidered slippers and tapestries that screamed, "Do not touch me, peasant," weren't immune to winter's wrath. Castles may have had stone walls, but those same walls acted like magnificent refrigerators. There are rather sad letters from noblewomen describing how the ink in their inkwells froze solid. Imagine being so desperate to journal your ennui and discovering that your quill now jackhammered against a popsicle. And so, the solution: keep moving, literally. In many households, rich or poor, one staying warm strategy involved constant motion, not metaphorical, emotionally resonant motion. No, we're talking about walking in slow laps around a room for hours, a kind of existential pacing that feels deeply relatable during any modern-day Zoom call. Of course, injuries were also the season's uncrowned monarchs. Icy roads, broken limbs, and illnesses with Latin names that all sounded vaguely like cold soup. Pneumonia, pleurisy, pericarditis, and those were just from stepping outside. Staying in, you had to contend with carbon monoxide. Yes, when fires were kept burning without chimneys, or with chimneys that functioned more like backward vacuums, you could, hypothetically, warm yourself into a cozy, toasty nap you never woke from. So folks adapted creatively. Chimneys got taller, beds moved closer to fires, people wore more layers than a retired onion, and food went from survival to strategy. Long before refrigerators, folks turned to salting, drying, pickling, fermenting, and in brave moments, daring to eat things that had accidentally fermented themselves. Hence the glory of preserved fish, stale bread soup, and the annual familial debate over whether that jar of meat was edible or haunted. Children, meanwhile, took to sledding on animal bones, a pastime both morbid and genuinely admired by historians with a nose for danger and fun. Wooden sleds were for the bourgeoisie. Your average peasant child had a jawbone, yes, really, and a hill. And that, apparently, was more than enough. And through it all, the cold was an equalizer. It knocked at the doors of manor and moss-thatched hut alike, a silent reminder that nature's timing did not respect harvests, calendars, or crowns. But somewhere beneath all those layers, beside those smoky hearths and rationed marmots, humanity kept laughing, surviving, and occasionally ice skating on questionable lakes, because when everything freezes, even time slows, and the world becomes quiet enough to hear your own heartbeat, if not your goat's latest opinion. Now, shimmer through the snow-drifted haze as we softly drift nearer to the next hidden danger that waited in the chill beyond the hearth. As the snow thickened and the night stretched out like an old man's stories about the good old days, something rather strange happened to people in early northern Europe. They slowed down, not metaphorically, not out of laziness or melancholy, but quite literally. Their bodies surrendered to winter in a way that seems almost mythological now, but might have been as natural as hanging up your goat wool socks by the fire. You see, in certain frigid medieval villages scattered across Finland, Norway, and the colder sleeves of Russia, humans may have entered something eerily close to hibernation. Yes, hibernation. Like bears, squirrels, or that one uncle who only seems to reappear once defrosting season begins. Now, science hasn't certified this fully, mostly because the people involved didn't leave behind helpful January, slept like a marmot diary entries. But there is compelling folklore, odd burial clues, and a suspicious number of tales describing villagers all curled up in silence for weeks on end. Food was scarce, nights were endless, and before the invention of radiators or quality mittens, sometimes the best way to survive winter was simply to stop moving altogether. Imagine it, entire households piling onto wooden sleeping platforms, not so much lying down as strategically layering themselves into human lasagna beneath thick furs and stitched together wool. They would sleep through the day, nap through the night, and quietly conserve body heat, like time-traveling introverts determined to avoid doing literally anything until spring. Children were taught to lie still. Parents rationed not just food, but motion itself. Gossip paused. Chores deferred. Household tempo was slowed to that of a tortoise on a casual Sunday. The only sign of life might be someone slowly chewing on whatever salted fish or cracked grain they'd managed to hoard before the snow walls went up. The closest modern term for this is hiverner, a lovely French verb meaning to winter. But while the French preferred to hiverner in cozy chalets with croissants and mild nihilism, medieval villagers hivernered by essentially turning themselves into quiet furniture. If that sounds exaggerated, let me remind you that these were people without coffee, artificial light, or dental insurance. Their main source of heat was often a fire so smoky, it doubled as both life-giver and lung destroyer. Sleeping away your troubles was not a luxury. It was a survival plan. It was also, frankly, an extremely economic use of time if your only other option was staring at the wall and hoping your remaining turnip didn't die of loneliness. Some historians propose that our ancestors naturally allowed their metabolisms to drop during these dark months. There are even modern-day accounts from terribly remote areas where people still report sleeping over 15 hours a day in the worst of winter, waking only to eat a bit, stretch gently, and complain about how the goats are depressed. This semi-hibernation wasn't just a peasant quirk. Aristocrats, too, retreated indoors, often abandoning chilly stone castles for cozy manor houses, or even heading south if they could afford the luxury of things like not freezing. But for those who stayed, warmth lived not in fireplaces, but in clumps. Families slept together in heaps, often with livestock smushed indoors for shared warmth. Yes, this means your great-great-great-grandsomeone almost certainly took a nap with a goat named Pecker, nestled against their knees. And honestly, that goat was probably the warmest, most socially functioning member of the household. But let's not get lost in the goat pile just yet. What's fascinating is how this winter idleness wove itself into the social fabric. Stories were told in hushed tones, passed down like living lullabies. Legends lingered in the smoke above people's heads, while their bodies remained wrapped in stillness, half-forgotten dreams, and the faint scent of stewed cabbage. It was a version of life suspended, not dead, not active, just paused, like the earth itself was drawing breath and waiting for permission to exhale. We tend to think of ancient winters as perilous times of desperation, and they certainly were. But even in all that dread, there was something beautiful about this surrender. The world got smaller. Time got slower. Survival meant not just endurance, but patience. There are whispered lessons here about doing less, about honoring the season, about not always needing to conquer the cold, but sometimes simply curling beneath it. And when spring finally cracked open its icy seal, when the sun remembered its job and the rivers began to complain in liquid tones, people stirred once more, stiff, blinking, mildly surprised to still be alive, a little grumpy at the goat, but alive. And yet, just beneath those yawns and stretches, a new challenge emerged, one that would haunt medieval winters even more than frostbite or half-frozen porridge. Not everyone who slept through the cold could afford to sleep away their hunger. And so, before we return to the sleepy rhythm of our tale, it's time to meet winter's truest villain, famine, and the strangely creative ways people tried, and sometimes failed, to eat their way around it. In the dark swirl of medieval winter, when the wind howled like a disgruntled choir of monks and the skies hung low like damp wool, villagers wrapped themselves in everything they owned and hoped the snow wouldn't last until spring's second thoughts. Frost wasn't just seasonal flare. It was a creeping predator, working silently through wall chinks, unshuttered windows, and the laughably bad insulation made from, among other things, bundled moss and unjustified optimism. Castles didn't fare much better. While poets like to wax on about roaring hearths and tapestries fluttering in torchlight, the truth is that most of those stone fortresses were about as cozy as a wet sock. The great halls may have impressively high ceilings, but heat, like anyone with sense, rises and escapes. Down below, folks sat huddled near fireplaces as if queuing for a miracle, chuckling politely at each other's teeth, chattering in Morse code. One unexpected winter menace. Chimneys. Yes, the very invention designed to channel away smoke and keep folks from feeling like smoked hams themselves, was, in the Middle Ages, still in its charming experimental phase. Before chimneys became common in dwellings, people lived with open hearths in the centre of their homes, and the smoke, in theory, just floated up and out through little holes in the roof. In practice, however, it tended to hang around like an uninvited guest, forming a sooty cloud layer that may have shortened lifespans, but at least kept the bugs out. Once chimneys finally did arrive, largely thanks to the Normans who just loved importing things like invasions and clever masonry, they increased airflow, and with it, wintertime hazards. You see, hot sparks and dry thatch do not a safe combination make. Convenience won battles, but fire won the war on medieval roofing. Imagine now a cold winter's night in a humble peasant's hovel. A thatched roof overhead, a single hearth ablaze with the last of the season's firewood, and somebody's half-blind grandmother muttering warnings about frost spirits and the importance of hanging onions by the door. No one was really sure what onions did for winter safety, but superstition has long been a more convincing motivator than logic when both are equally underfed. Speaking of fire and cold, curious how civilizations never stopped needing both. The ancient Romans, clever as they were, invented the hypocaust, an underfloor heating system that pumped hot air beneath their villas and bathhouses. Imagine the luxury of warm tiles between your toes in the year 112. Magnificent. The only downside, maintenance. Any self-respecting Roman aristocrat had to employ several slaves just to keep the fires stoked, and in the event of a malfunction, well, a hypocaust and a chimney have at least one thing in common. Neither reacts well to a squirrel getting involved. Travellers, too, had their share of winter perils. Whether a whispery Norse trader trudging through a snow-drifted fjord, or an over-ambitious medieval pilgrim convinced that walking across Europe in December was definitely divinely advised, winter roads were more than just slippery. They were deadly. Poor visibility, freezing temperatures, and the occasional hungry wolf distributed along the route like terribly organized toll booths made travel something of a gamble. Inns were few and not particularly heated. Blankets were communal, if they existed at all, and what passed for mattress filling was typically straw, hay, or if someone felt fancy, whatever was left after a horse sneezed. But perhaps one of the most underappreciated perils of a historical winter was boredom. When snow turned every known road into a freezing white abyss, you were stuck indoors, often under the same roof, with a dozen relatives, 2 chickens, and a goat named after your second cousin. Because why not? Entertainment was limited. You could tell stories, compose riddles, or, if you were lucky, play music. But most of the time, people just sat near the fire, stared at the flames, and tried not to strangle anyone before the snow melted. Cabin fever wasn't diagnosed back then, but it most certainly was experienced. So amid freezing stone castles, smoke-choked cottages, and biting wind that could chisel the ego off a baron, the winter was not just a season. It was an ordeal. Yet, even through the hardships, humans trudge forward with all the stubborn resilience of someone who refuses to admit that they're cold because they already said they weren't cold 20 minutes ago. And as the last ember glows on that medieval hearth, flickering against thick shadows and frost-glazed shutters, our journey now turns toward how those brave, or perhaps masochistic souls try to predict and prepare for these bleak seasons. Sometimes, with the help of peculiar tools, stranger sciences, and even odder saints. When we think of winter today, we often imagine snowflakes lilting from the sky, like dandruff from a particularly relaxed snowman, fireplaces crackling like they're auditioning for a holiday commercial, and questionable knitwear appearing with quiet vengeance from drawers. But once upon a time, not long ago, historically speaking, winter wasn't a season of frosted merriment. It was a perilous gauntlet of survival, ingenuity, and occasionally outright nonsense. Take, for instance, the medieval tradition of overwintering. That's not a quaint agricultural term. It was what people did when the world froze over and everyone quietly agreed to. Do as little as possible. If you imagine peasants hibernating like economic bears, you're not entirely wrong. Most work ground to a halt. Fields, buried, livestock, bleating resentfully in barns that blocked 60% of the wind and 0% of the smell. This was prime, let's sit still under blankets and hope spring hasn't taken a sabbatical season. Food storage was life or death. In place of modern preservatives, artificial or suspicious, people relied on salt, smoke, and sheer stubborn hope. Meats were smoked until they resembled edible bricks. Cabbages, those noble winter vegetables, were stored in cellars so cold and dark that they likely developed personalities. Fermentation was both a necessity and, to the uninitiated, a brave act of culinary optimism. You had to believe that those bubbling jars wouldn't turn into poison. Sometimes they did anyway. Winter also brought on a peculiar psychological state that historians don't talk about nearly enough. The season of the uninvited cousin. You see, when travel became treacherous and food was scarce, it wasn't uncommon for distant relatives to drop by and then stay approximately forever. Medieval households, already cozy in the architectural sense, meaning small, smoky, and slightly flammable, would become hostels for every third cousin from 2 villages over. Just imagine 20 people sharing a room, 1 fire, and a bucket. Yes, that kind of bucket. It does tend to take the gloss off the phrase family gathering. And let's not even begin with plumbing. Or rather, let's briefly shiver at the fact that there was no plumbing. Waste management involved chamber pots and a sense of timing. If you think shuffling outside today to take out the trash in winter is unpleasant, consider the fate of chamber pot bearers who had to trek through knee-deep snow just to unburden a bucket of medieval regrets. The rest of the time, windows were opened, very, very quickly, and then closed with equal urgency for fear of letting the cold in, or worse, the smell out. But perhaps the most underrated horror of winter in history was fashion. Folks were fond of layering, sure, but clothing was made of wool thick enough to double as low-level armor. Garments took hours to put on, days to dry, and functioned largely on the principle of, if you're still cold, add another sheep to the pile. In the 17th century, Elizabethan nobles wore outfits so dense in material that they rattled slightly when walking, like fancy maracas with gout. common folks bundled themselves in every available scrap, achieving what could only be described as seasonal potato sack chic. Yet through this all, civilization staggered onward like a frostbitten but determined goose. Communities developed rituals around winter, not just for utility, but for warmth, both physical and emotional. Wassailing, for instance, began as a toasty little custom of good cheer and drunkenly singing at apple trees to ensure a good harvest. Yes, someone somewhere thought yelling at fruit would please it into growing better next year. Strangely, it may have worked, or the trees were simply too intimidated to not bear fruit. In Scandinavia, with their endless bleak winters, communities would build immense braziers for public fires. Picture this: twinkling snow, children shrieking with red-cheeked laughter, and burly Norse villagers arguing over who stole whose axe, all around a bonfire large enough to grill a whale. It was oddly communal, kind of cozy, and slightly dangerous, which also describes most winter pastimes prior to electricity. Despite the relentless cold and frequent setbacks, humans kept innovating. We wrapped ourselves in pelts, salted unidentifiable meats, and sang songs we barely understood because they rhymed and passed the time. Winter, in its most biting form, demanded creativity, and, in a time with limited entertainment options, a sense of humor. You had to laugh when your shoes froze to the floor overnight, or the family goat joined you under the covers. Not laughing might mean remembering how long it was until spring. Eventually, of course, necessity birthed curiosity. And that's when people began working on new ways to heat their homes without accidentally lighting them on fire. But that tangled trail of warmth and invention, well, that's another quiet mystery we'll settle into next. In the ink-dark quiet of a medieval winter, the hearth was more than a source of warmth. It was the axis on which the entire household spun. You didn't just sit by the fire, you orbited it, like a cold, shivering moon desperate to escape the frozen pool of your stone-floored celestial prison. The fireplace wasn't just a decorative nook. It was the beating heart of the home, the Wi-Fi router of heat. Except if your signal dropped here, your toes might very literally fall off. Homes of the time weren't exactly models of insulation. Drafts entered where they pleased, under the door, through the shutter slats, between the cracks in the daub and wattle walls, and occasionally, as if just to be cheeky, down the chimney itself in a reverse Santa move. The result? An eternal indoor breeze that hummed a song of good luck with that frostbite, my liege. Richer households clothed themselves and their rooms in layers upon layers, curtains around beds, tapestries on the walls, feather-stuffed mattresses, wool upon wool upon wool. Meanwhile, peasants, who were both the economic backbone of society and perpetually bone-cold, layered whatever textiles they could find, which sometimes included burlap, or, if they were very lucky, stolen bits of their lord's discarded under-tunic. Desperate times, desperate sleeves. Sleeping arrangements weren't so much about comfort as they were about survival. Families piled into the same bed like puppies, parents, children, possibly a cousin who'd popped in unexpectedly, and sometimes a goat named Gerald for good thermal measure. Modern sensibilities might balk, but in frostbitten huts, personal space was a privilege of the dead. Even language took on a cozy gloom. The phrase three-dog night, often credited to colder than a witch's toes kind of evenings in places like Australia, referred to sleeping with 3 dogs in bed just to keep warm. Now, whether this originated from Arctic explorers, lonely farmers, or someone deeply oblivious to the concept of pet hair, remains blurrily comical. But what's certain is that if the dogs also complained about the temperature, things had gone truly grave. Clothing, too, often served double duty. You didn't just dress in the morning, you basically never really undressed. Your daywear often became your nightwear, and your nightwear, frankly, didn't get a break. Fashion was less about flair and more about frost prevention. Long woolen cloaks, fur-lined hats, mittens the size of small loaves, and hose that stretched from toes to thighs. The expression "sleep tight" wasn't a quaint bedtime wish. It was wishful thinking in a world where the strings of your straw mattress needed to be pulled taut, or you'd literally fall through. And while we're discussing beds, let's take a moment for the trundle bed. A low, often wheeled sleeping platform stored beneath a main bed and pulled out at night for spare sleeping space. It was the medieval version of a Netflix couch surfing guest. Was there elegance in rolling yourself under your landlord after dark like a human drawer? Not much, but in winter, a disappointing degree of proximity had a surprising charm. Those with means sometimes turned to bizarre, fleeting fads to keep their bones from freezing. Heated bricks wrapped in cloth, pans filled with embers and slid beneath bed covers, also known as warming pans. These were comforting but occasionally treacherous. With one inattentive flick of a glowing coal, an attempt to warm Aunt Margaret became a small domestic fire. Not a great trade. Yet winter wasn't all threat and frost. In the stillness of snow-blanketed fields and ice-quiet forests, humans leaned further into storytelling, music, faith, and invention. The long nights bred reflection and resilience. In these hush-hush evenings, it was said you could hear the trees freeze, a brittle whisper, like ghostly knitting needles clacking over your roof. It is among those glistening icicle days and soot-scented nights that humanity began to stitch together its earliest strategies for bearing the cold. After all, no one sought snowball fights or frosty feasts. To winter was to endure, to hibernate a little with your kin, your goat, and your drafty, groaning roof. And always, always with an eye on the dwindling firewood. Now, with a snow-laced breeze still curling beneath the door, let's shuffle forward a few centuries, to a time when inventors, bumpkins, and nap-prone aristocrats all tried their hands at a revolutionary dream, warming the whole house. How hard could it be? Well, you'll see. As the days shortened and the shadows lengthened across frostbitten fields, one ancient enemy returned again and again with seasonal punctuality. Winter's uninvited sidekick, fire. No, not the cozy, marshmallow roasting kind. We're talking about the kind that reduces half a village to smouldering memories because someone got a bit too ambitious with a hearth and a thatched roof. In early history, fire wasn't just a helpful companion. It was also the most unpredictable guest at the winter feast. Homes made of dried timbers, packed straw insulation, and a general architectural theme best described as flammable enthusiasm, often meant that staying warm could lead to being rather well done. Picture a longhouse in 9th century Scandinavia, filled with cloaks, goats, and gossip. A central hearth, forever smoking and popping, was responsible for both survival and, occasionally, catastrophe. One moment, Grandma's stew is wafting fragrantly across the room. The next, the wind howls down the chimney, fans an ember. And suddenly, everyone is outside, barefoot in the snow, watching their furniture become firewood in real time. And if you're imagining early medieval fire brigades, clad in fur-lined helmets, rushing to save the day with a proto-hose and a bucket chain, I'm afraid not. Fire safety manuals in those days were more of a personal, experiential genre. By the time people understood the phrase, "Don't build your entire house out of kindle," it was usually because their last one no longer existed. Then there were the clothes. Oh, the outfits of yore. Woolen, layered, and about as fire-resistant as a dry haystack. If you stood too close to the hearth while warming your toes, you might find yourself transforming into a flickering cautionary tale. And since winter meant everyone was competing for the prime hearth zones, this happened with alarming regularity. "Where's Uncle Bjorn?" "Ah, he got a little too cozy by the fire last week." Even in the Middle Ages, cities like London and Paris understood that fire in winter was less a tool and more a test. In fact, London passed its very first fire-related building laws as early as the 12th century, requiring homes to be built with stone instead of wood. A noble effort, though enforcement lagged well behind enthusiasm. After all, when you've got freezing fog in your bones, stone takes a long time to warm, whereas wood practically glows with optimism. Fire wasn't just a menace to homes. Entire food stores were at risk. Winter larders, carefully stocked over the autumn, could vanish in a single blaze sparked by nothing more scandalous than someone knocking over a candle with their elbow while reaching for pickled cabbage. Flames, ironically, loved pickled cabbage almost as much as medieval peasants did, slightly more, if you count how often it led to a roaring blaze. Meanwhile, monasteries, arguably the best organized communities of the medieval world, had their own fire dangers. Monks would sit in tight groups, translating precious texts in delightfully flammable scriptoria, heated by open braziers. All it took was an ill-timed cough, a falling wax taper, or a poorly trained cat, and centuries of illuminated wisdom could vanish in a poof of ironic smoke. And yet, despite this peril, fire remained necessary. It baked bread, dried boots, brewed ale, scared off wolves, and gave stagnant castle rooms a breath of warmth. And so, people huddled close to it during the long nights, whispering stories and sharing news, wrapped in flickering light and soft wool. Fire might have been a wild card, but it was their wild card. The orange heart of a cold, slow winter. Sometimes, in particularly cold years, fire was blamed for things it didn't even do. In 1326, in a little village near the Rhine, an overheated chimney was held responsible for what was later discovered to be a roof collapse due to snow. The chimney was not available for comment, but through the glow and the danger, fire taught communities the delicate balance of warmth and caution. A lesson passed down in cautious parents' warnings, singed door frames, and a village-wide understanding that "don't poke the flames" wasn't just a mantra. It was an annual survival strategy. Still, as we ease back, imagining a flickering hearth, casting sleepy shadows across cold stone floors, we can almost hear the gentle creak of a wooden chair, the soft sigh of fleece cloaks warming slowly, and the knowledge that tomorrow, if the snow didn't get you, something else just might. But perhaps the wind has quieted now, and the embers have softened to a glow. Let's stay tucked beside the fire a little longer, because soon enough, we'll step outside where other frostier dangers waited patiently in the snow-covered woods. In the quiet hush of the medieval tundra, also known as anywhere north of the Alps after October, there was one woodland creature more talked about than wolves, witches, or wily French tax collectors: the common chimney. Yes, the chimney. That cold stone chimney, often accused of nothing but soot and silence, was, ironically, the hottest innovation of its time. Before that tall stack of rocks and regret came along, fire had to live. Right in the middle of the room, in a big hole, with smoke floating freely into everyone's eyes and lungs, politely sharing the experience, and people lived with that for centuries. Early houses had what was charmingly known as central hearths, and what modern humans might call a terrible respiratory decision. These were essentially indoor campfires with hopes, dreams, and an unfortunate tendency to kill you in your sleep via smoke inhalation. The goal, of course, was warmth, but the side effects included permanent coughing, walls blackened with soot, and grandmothers suspiciously resembling well-dressed raisins. As the outside temperatures dropped, families would gather around these central fires like sleepy moths, adding whatever fuel they could find: wood, dung, peat moss, or occasionally the neighbor's regrettably flammable poetry collection. But then, perhaps inspired by the desperate need to both survive and exhale, a brilliant idea slowly burned its way into human architecture. Let the smoke go up. It sounds obvious now, doesn't it? But inventing the chimney was like discovering windows or socks. People didn't know they needed it until someone showed up with one. And suddenly everyone wanted to copy Tim from across the village's magical smoke pipe. With chimneys rising above rooftops by the 12th and 13th centuries, life changed. Rooms were warmer. Air was clearer. Birds occasionally nested up there, leading to some memorable breakfast surprises. But most importantly, buildings could now have actual separate rooms, since fire didn't have to sit in the middle of the floor anymore, like an overbearing in-law. This shift let people create upstairs bedrooms that weren't filled with carbon monoxide. It allowed for privacy, layers of living space, and architecture that could finally experiment with being cozy. Yet not all was soot-free joy. Chimneys brought their own winter drama. For one thing, they needed cleaning. And if there's one job history has unequivocally proven, it hated more than leach collecting or moat draining. It was chimney sweeping, especially in winter. Before industrial brushes waltzed onto the scene, soot removal was a job reserved for orphan children and deeply unlucky apprentices. Climbing inside those cold, narrow stone structures was risky, dirty work, made much worse by snow, ice, and the haunting knowledge that yesterday's turkey bones were still smouldering in the ashes below. And worse still, chimneys could catch fire. Soot, especially when built up and mixed with creosote, which sounds like a lovely French cheese, but is actually just a highly flammable tar, could ignite spectacularly. Roaring chimney fires were common in poorly kept homes, especially after the Yule log had a little too much Yuletide. Imagine an unsuspecting peasant warming themselves beside the hearth, only to hear a sudden whoosh and look up as flames licked their roof beams like a fire sprite at an all-you-can-toast banquet. But perhaps the most tragic, frostbitten side effect of chimney culture was the illusion of safety it offered. People believed that once they had a chimney and a room with 4 walls, you could simply stuff a cowhide in the window hole and call it insulation. That was not the case. Winds whistled through gaps in wattle and daub walls, and snow crept through the edges of thatched roofs like a white, whispering thief. Cold settled into bones, and even beside a fire, toes remained tragically unthawed. Still, compared to the dark, smoky huts of centuries past, a chimney felt like a promise, a flickering hope in the heart of winter, a chance to build upward, outward, beyond the fire pit built on clay and resignation. And with that upward movement came something else: attics. But attics had their secrets. Curious little spaces they were, the kind of places where winter winds remembered your name. And in some societies, they were far more than just storage for out-of-season turnips. will gently push open the creaky trapdoor soon enough, when winter settled its snowy bottom on the rooftops of the medieval world. It didn't just bring chilly toes and frosty breath, it brought bureaucracy. Yes, dear listener, in some corners of the old world, winter was not only a season of snowdrifts and existential dread. It meant paperwork, or at least its parchmenty ancestor. Picture a manor house in 13th century England. The fire crackles faintly, more smoke than heat. Inside, beneath the drip of thawing rafters, the lord of the manor is not donning gleaming armor or readying for a joust. No, he's morosely squinting at tally sticks and muttering about tithes. Because winter, in all its frozen majesty, was also the perfect time to count things. When the fields were sleeping beneath their downy snow quilts, the peasants weren't toiling in the sun, and thus they were disturbingly available for taxation, census taking, and that favorite medieval pastime, paying rent in chickens. Feudalism, you see, ran on calendars and obligation. As soon as harvest wrapped up, the revelry of autumn ended, after, say, 3 straight weeks of mead-fueled brawling, and lords turned their attention to what really mattered, reminding their serfs that everything they just harvested wasn't actually theirs. In the long nights of December, reeves and stewards, those noble accountants of medieval life, would go door to door, sometimes on foot, sometimes on an unusually judgmental mule. Their goal? To ensure everyone had rendered unto the manor their fair share, a bushel of barley here, half a goat there, and something called a heriot, which was a sort of death tax, because in feudalism, not even dying got you out of obligations. What you owe when you shuffle off this mortal coil? Why, your best ox, obviously. Even the church, that venerable institution with a flair for incense and guilt, loved a good winter checklist. Monks and friars, draped in wool that barely held off the cold, tracked tithes owed by villagers barely hanging on themselves. 10% went to God, though oddly, he always left it at the door of the monastery. But paperwork wasn't the only administrative delight of the colder months. This was also the grand season of meetings that could have been scrolls. Local courts, known as manorial courts or court baron, operated like neighborhood watch groups, but with more broadswords and less donuts. Held in winter, these gatherings were often the social event of the season. People would show up not just to settle disputes, like who stole whose pig or whose cow had trespassed amorously on someone else's field, but also to catch up on village drama. Did you hear about Edith's new husband? He has 2 teeth. These proceedings might sound cozy, like medieval soap opera episodes scribbled in Latin. But remember, all this took place in stone buildings with no insulation, surrounded by people who hadn't bathed since Michaelmas. The drama was hot, but the toes were numb. Even kings and queens weren't immune to winter's bureaucratic charms. Royal courts often relocated to warmer, drier halls to spend the season combing through petitions. Archaic requests from loyal subjects that range from earnest pleas for justice to hilariously specific requests for tax exemption due to, say, an outbreak of sheep-related misfortune. It was as if winter invited everyone, high and low, to reflect, recalibrate, and reassert control over their corner of the realm. After all, when the roads turned to icy porridge and wolves loitered near the village green, what better way to maintain order than with lists, fines, and possibly a strongly worded proclamation nailed to a tree? Even the Vikings, those bearded poster children for frostbite and fury, slowed down in winter and convened their altings, open-air assemblies where laws were debated, Disputes were settled, and someone inevitably shouted, "That's not what we agreed on in Reykjavik." And all of it, courts, counts, quills tapping on lambskin parchment, reminds us of something truly cozy. Humans, freezing or not, have always found time to organize themselves, argue a little, and make winter just a touch more unbearable with taxes. But as parchment curled from the damp and candle flames flickered, lo, some did find solace in the ritual. There was a rhythm to it, a structure within the swirling snow. Next year would come, harvest would grow, and before long spring would peep in. First, though, some distant knock at the door, likely the steward again, asking very politely if you've paid your pig fee, which leads us ever so gently into the next curious tale about the remarkable importance of socks, or rather the lack thereof, as snow blanketed rooftops and turned hills into powdered dreams. A less magical transformation was happening below. Yes, deep beneath the frosted eaves and under the scratchy wool blankets of every poor soul who had the misfortune of living in medieval Europe, there was a battle. A daily, nightly, undignified battle to simply stay warm. You see, central heating hadn't yet been invented. Radiators were not humming gently in the corners of 13th century cottages. There was no thermostat to fiddle with passive-aggressively after someone else in the household claimed they weren't cold. No, warmth came from fire, and fire was fickle. Fire liked to flirt with smoke. Fire liked to live only in well-ventilated chimneys. Only those hadn't been very well invented yet either. In those early winters, you measured wealth not in coin or land, but in firewood and how dry your socks were. Everyone became amateur pyromaniacs. The entire village obsessed over kindling. Children were sent into the forest to collect firewood before they even fully grasped what trees were. Prayer rituals to saints often included a subtle request. Dear St. Bridget, may the fire stay lit, and may my toes not become frozen sausages overnight. Amen. Houses, especially in Europe's windier corners, were designed primarily to keep large animals in and smaller ones out, which unfortunately worked both ways in the coldest months. Rats moved in seeking warmth, so did spiders, cold air, and the occasional resigned chicken. Roofs leaked. Windows were just holes. Glass was a luxury, a sort of sparkly fantasy reserved for monasteries and men with titles like Baron of Third Breakfast. For most folks, windows had wooden shutters or bits of oiled cloth stretched across them, which is so close to modern camping that if you squint and add a marshmallow, it feels almost bougie. And yet, in the absence of insulation, enemies of the frost grew clever. They layered. Oh, how they layered. Undergarments, overgarments, cloaks, linen, wool, leather. If you could wear it, you wrapped it around yourself like a cabbage in a trance. There are recorded instances where changing clothes simply did not happen between November and March. People would just sort of add another tunic and hope for the best. At night, most households would huddle together on shared bedding stuffed with straw, feasting on body heat like slightly warmer, sleepier vampires. Dogs were not just welcome in bed. They were required. The term three-dog night, while more popularized by a certain 1970s band, probably had its roots in exactly this logic. It was cold enough to need several furry friends. And if you think royal courts were different, think again. Kings might have had bigger fires, but stone castles are essentially just fancy wind tunnels. Heating a castle was like trying to toast a loaf of bread with a birthday candle. Queen Elizabeth I was known to wear as many as 6 layers of clothing in winter, and that was for indoor appearances. By the time she got to her private chambers, she probably resembled an Elizabethan nesting doll. Regal, yes. Toasty, less so. But perhaps no medieval marvel better demonstrates the enemy that winter truly could be than the invention of the bed-warming pan. A shallow metal dish filled with glowing coals from the hearth. It was tucked between sheets before bedtime like a dangerous smoky lullaby. Now, we applaud the ingenuity. But imagine, just for a moment, you're exhausted after a long day scraping ice off your only spoon, and the final step before sleep is to place a small, burning metal pan inches from your face. Sweet dreams indeed. Speaking of dreams, food, or the lack of it, was a winter spectre all its own. You'd need enough salted fish, smoked meats, root vegetables, and ale to last through months of icy hibernation. Many peasant families essentially became pickling professionals by necessity. Late autumn was not just pumpkin spice season. It was centuries-long prep for surviving the winter without having your pantry turn against you. But the most underestimated winter peril? Boredom. With fields frozen, travel impossible, and nothing but flickering candlelight, and the same family stories every night. It's no wonder so many folk tales were invented. Dark, mysterious, gloomy tales that curled up like frost on the edges of glassless windows and promised that spring, eventually, would return. And before the return of spring, or even the hope of it, there was still February. Grim, unforgiving. A month so cold it became a unit of merit in endurance. But that, dear listener, is a chilly story best saved for tomorrow evening, as our breath fogs up the past just a little bit more. As winter tiptoed across medieval Europe, delicately dusting rooftops and moats with frost, one class of professional warriors found themselves in an especially precarious position: the messengers. Now, we mustn't forget, this was an era before text messages, telegrams, or even those delightfully dramatic Victorian carrier pigeons with fancy neckwear. No, in the brutish cold of the 12th century, if you wanted to tell your rival cousin 2 kingdoms over that you wouldn't be attending their coronation due to a pressing case of feuding right now, please don't ask, you had to dispatch a human being, a person, an actual physical body, tramping through the sleet with rough wool cloaks and a half-frozen donkey. And in winter, well, being a messenger became less a job and more a seasonal endurance contest. Messages had to be memorized or sewn into tunics or hidden cleverly inside candle stubs because medieval bandits didn't suspect candles. You see, winter travel wasn't just cold. It was a sort of choose-your-own-adventure book in Latin, with only dreadful endings. Turn to page 37 to slip into a frozen ravine. Turn to page 49 to meet a bear. Turn to page 58 if you'd like to spend the night in a leaking barn with a drunk goat. But still, the messages went through, for love, for politics, and occasionally just to remind your rival that your ancestors were, in fact, more noble. Then there were the supply trains. Because naturally, kingdoms still needed things like grain, wool, and cheese, even after the first snow fell. Not that snow was the problem. It was all the hidden surprises underneath the snow. One moment, your reluctant oxen are trudging peacefully down a roadway. The next, 1 foot through what everyone swore was solid ground. And suddenly, you're waist deep in something referred to as marshy regret. Caravans tried to stick to the frozen rivers for convenience, essentially nature's version of an express lane. But ice has a sense of humor that can't be fully appreciated until it decides, without warning, that it's tired of being a solid. And thus, entire carts of salted herring took surprise swimming lessons. their barrels bobbing forlornly down the current. The nobility did have one slight advantage: the ability to not leave the manor house at all. Winter for the wealthy was best handled by staying firmly indoors, surrounded by tapestries, a fire hot enough to gently bake your shins, and several harps playing in rotation. If you were lucky, you could wait out the entire season without once seeing sunlight, other than that one time you threw boiling water out a window and watched it turn to snow mid-air. A truly popular pastime. But for the clergy, the monks, stoic, hooded, perpetually chilly monks. Their winter task lists included noble things like praying, copying sacred texts, and redigging the same frozen trench with sarcastic regularity because Brother Gerolf insisted it was a metaphor. Entire abbeys would spend the darkest months translating Greek philosophy with frostbitten fingers, binding the pages in calfskin, and heating their ink to keep it from becoming medieval popsicles. In some monasteries, elaborate systems were put in place to stay just warm enough, like hand-cranked bellows attached to fireplaces, or poorly ventilated libraries full of candle smoke and whispered Latin. Comfort gave way to devotion, and the occasional stealthy cup of wine. Special mention must go to winter festivals that tried, heroically and usually in vain, to lighten the mood. Festivals like Saturnalia or Yule were meant to lift spirits, often physically with some sort of ale. In towns where snowdrifts had turned alleyways into impromptu slides, children invented the first ice-adjacent sports. Meanwhile, adults invented reasons not to participate, citing sore knees, religious obligations, or the dangers of too much merriment involving flaming torches. Even amid hardship, people found ways to adapt. A shoveled path might connect 4 cottages in a village, referred to as the winter circuit, along which food was shared, stories exchanged, and the local gossip made its solemn rounds, wrapped in wool and mild deceit. But while the people braved roads that disappeared under ice, and letters frosted into unreadable blurbs, a quieter danger loomed indoors. Something as small as a cough, tucked into a corner of a longhouse, warming just like the rest of the household. And in winter, a simple illness could spread with remarkable ease, no worse than a tale told round the hearth. But that is a whisper for another evening. Yes, frostbite and medieval footwear, a pairing that went together slightly less harmoniously than peanut butter and sand. As the calendar crept toward the deep grey of European winter, few things struck more terror into the hearts of peasants, knights, and bakers alike than the sharp, unrelenting cold, and the absolutely terrible shoes they had to face it in. You see, footwear in the Middle Ages was more of a polite suggestion than a genuine insulation strategy. In the 1200s, it wasn't uncommon to see villagers trying to survive February with shoes made of thin leather, or, if you were truly devoted to suffering, a sort of felted wool daintily stitched together and optimistically called a boot. These so-called shoes had the water resistance of a paper towel and insulation comparable to a disappointed sigh. The wealthy, of course, had different priorities. Nobles often chose fashion over frostbite prevention. In 14th century court circles, elongated pointy shoes called poulaines were all the rage. These were shoes with tips so long they could double as ski bindings in the event of a surprise downhill. Their protective function was somewhere between none and hypothermia delivery mechanism. But they looked fabulous, and agents of frostbite took no exceptions for style. Now, when frostbite came knocking, which it often did, it showed up uninvited, rude as ever, and began with toes. It always started with toes. These poor metatarsal pioneers bore the brunt of medieval miscalculation. Caught between hard-packed snow and a barely there slipper, they would slowly lose feeling, colour, and eventually their tenancy. There were no frostbite specialists, no hand warmers, and certainly no hot cocoa waiting by a fire. At best, you had a wooden shoe packed with straw and a prayer mumbled toward the hearth. Some clever souls, particularly in Scandinavia and parts of Siberia, did what clever souls tended to do. They looked at nature and copied it. The Sami people, for example, wore reindeer skins with the fur facing inward, effectively wrapping their feet in what amounted to extremely cozy meat slippers. Stuffed with grass or moss for added insulation, these boots made medieval European fashion look like the clothing equivalent of a bad dare. But in the icy north, practicality beat pulchritude every time. Even Roman soldiers, those famed marchers of empire, had their icy trials. They wore sandals, yes, sandals, in northern Britain in January. To compensate, they added wool wrappings which, upon exposure to snow and muck, turned into a sort of slushy foot soup. It's a miracle any of them lived long enough to leave graffiti complaining about the cold, which, amusingly, they did. Of course, medieval physicians had their own views on cold weather injuries, and by views, we mostly mean complete guesswork laced with herbs and a sprig of superstition. Frostbite treatments varied from honey compresses to heated stones pressed against your feet, which sounds soothing until you remember temperature control wasn't exactly an exact science. More than one unfortunate soul may have traded blackened toes for lightly scorched arches. And yet, in the midst of all this toe tragedy, there was warmth to be found, often directly above the ankles. Wool hose, layered tunics, and floor-length cloaks did a respectable job keeping the rest of the body warm. Hearths crackled in every hall and hovel, though chimney design hadn't quite caught on in all regions, which made for very smoky evenings and the occasional surprise ceiling fire. In especially bitter winters, people would sleep together in bundles, family, friends, and occasionally a very startled chicken, all huddled in shared warmth. While not exactly a memory foam mattress with adjustable lumbar support, these arrangements had their advantages, chiefly not dying. And this is the sort of cozy, pragmatic logic that defined pre-modern life. So, as silent snow blanketed forests and moors, and wind crept through ill-fitted shutters, a kind of seasonal truce settled over medieval life. The work slowed down. Outdoor tasks gave way to mending, storytelling, and watching your neighbour pretend he hadn't just lit his boot on fire trying to dry it too close to the hearth. Somewhere between the blizzards and blistered toes, humanity shivered and adapted, layering wool over wisdom and straw under souls. They didn't always win against winter, but they did learn, stitch by stitch, fire by fire. And just when you thought the cold couldn't have any more tricks up its frostbitten sleeve, the rivers froze solid, horses skidded dramatically, and entire battles ground to a wintry halt. But that, dear dreamer, is a story best unfurled gently, in time. There is perhaps no greater monument to winter hardship than the long, noble battle between humans and bread. Yes, bread, that crusty cornerstone of civilization, that noble, yeasty companion, that oddly aerodynamic thing you could throw in a food fight. Bread didn't bake itself, of course, and long before the advent of sourdough starters lovingly doted upon in artisanal kitchens, early humans had to perform the delicate winter ballet of not freezing, not starving, and not burning down the only dry shelter they had, even if all they wanted was a toasty crumb. You see, in medieval and early modern times, Winter baking was an undertaking so risky, so complex, it would have made reality television jealous. First, there was the problem of flour, precious, perishable, extremely flammable flour. It had to be harvested months before and then protected from dampness, rodents, and sudden mold-related betrayals. Whole medieval families were emotionally invested in sacks of grain the way modern people are about Wi-Fi signals. But even if you had managed to hoard some flour, you couldn't just bake willy-nilly. No. In most villages, ovens were communal. A single stone monolith nestled in some frostbitten square where everyone came weekly with their pale, hopeful loaves tucked under wool blankets. It had to be fired up carefully with great logs, which were, surprise, also in short supply. Wood doesn't grow on trees. Wait. Well, you know what I mean. It was either burn the bed frame or go breadless. The oven, when finally hot enough, became a pulsing, glowing miracle. Villagers queued for their turns like dedicated medieval fans waiting for medieval Beyoncé. And the loaves, once they went in, had to bake under shared supervision. Woe betide the person whose barley roll burned and gave everyone's rye a smoky twang. Serious feuds could erupt over singed crust. To make things worse, yeast didn't come in charming little foil packets. Winter temperatures wreaked havoc on sourdough starters. Too cold, they'd go dormant. Too moist, mold attack. And heaven forbid you spilled your last bit into the snow. Then you might just end up trying your luck with ale balm, the frothy leftovers of beer brewing. This made for fun guessing games like, is this loaf going to rise, collapse, or become an accidental science project? And then there was the question of fermentation. If your starter did survive, through sheer tenacity, witchcraft, or talking nicely to it, your dough required warmth to rise. No thermostat, of course. So what did you do? You wore it. People literally kept dough warm by resting it near their body under cloaks. Some cuddled with it in bed. A vaguely risque but deliciously efficient snuggle system. If it wasn't quite a practical romance novel yet, give it time. And let's not forget how bread wasn't just food. It was winter insurance. In Eastern Europe, for instance, it was common to bake enormous, rye-heavy loaves in late autumn that could last all winter. These weren't quaint baguettes. These were wheels of dense survival, so thick that cutting them was a job for your strongest neighbor, and a small axe. Not particularly fluffy, but nutritiously committed. But oh, if a blizzard took down the supply lines, or rats had discovered the delights of grain before you did, or if those massive communal loaves molded from the inside out, then breadlessness meant calorie loss, and calorie loss in the cold. Well, that was an express route to hibernation. Or worse, even royalty wasn't immune. In the chilly palaces of the north, when roads closed under snow and rivers froze, even noblemen could find themselves eating hard black bread stored in cellars. They'd gnaw politely with chilled dignity, pretending to enjoy what basically amounted to historical drywall, sprinkled with a few privileges. Still, bread was the winter heartbeat. People blessed it, broke it, fought over it, and dreamed of it. Entire festivals celebrated the first crusty return of decent loaves when spring arrived and yeast behaved properly again. And yet, as the wind howled through those timbered cottages and the communal oven hissed its final embers, those who managed to score a warm slice, charred a little, dense perhaps, but undeniably theirs, would take a bite and, for a moment, feel the frost retreat. Tomorrow would demand more effort, more firewood, more creative dough placement. But for the night, with even the bread wearing a cloak of steam. Villages fell into hush. Risings slowed, and even the snow seemed to grow still. Which brings us to an entirely different kind of winter necessity, the somewhat questionable art of keeping lamps lit when oil was nearly nowhere to be found. There is a particular kind of silence that arrives with deep winter, not the graceful hush of a snowy postcard, but the heavy quiet that comes when all the chickens have stopped laying. The cows look unimpressed by your hay offerings, and the wind has the audacity to come in sideways. This was the sort of silence that medieval villagers in Northern Europe came to know far too well. Winter didn't simply bring cold in the old world. It brought a slowing of life to the point of something like paralysis. Harvest had long since ended. The small root cellar, affectionately referred to as the food hole by folks who didn't have the luxury of optimism, was now yielding the last of its withered turnips and feeling suspiciously less full with each daily inspection. The grain sacks stood shrinking in the corners like embarrassed guests overstaying their welcome. And then came the snow. Even when it was only a light dusting, it wrapped everything in a deceptive coating of calm. But this was not the soothing kind of snow you see in modern holiday movies, where everyone has teeth and options. This was an altogether more cynical snow, the kind that blocked roads, buried firewood, and made every trip to the outhouse a daring alpine expedition. In many villages, winter created barriers not only of logistics, but also of rumor. Once travel became impossible, and it often did, villages became isolated pockets of human survival, each one essentially left to its own devices. In these micro-worlds, news did not arrive, and neither did bread. The boredom, one imagines, was so thick you could stir it with a ladle. And so people turned to storytelling, superstition, and just the right amount of petty drama to keep busy. Now, among medieval punishments, winter itself was as punishing as anything. At least the stocks gave you closure. But winter just lowered the light, squeezed the belly, and waited. Sometimes a cough would echo in the rafters, just a little one at first, and everyone would quietly and simultaneously agree not to talk about it. Because everyone knew, any illness that arrived after the solstice tended to linger like a disinterested house guest. Coughs, colds, and the fearsome winter fevers swept through tightly sealed homes like bored wolves. Entire families would stay clustered around the hearth, huddling not just for warmth, but for a collective morale against the creeping dread. The fire was everything. It was heat, yes, but it was also light in a season stingy with it, and emotional support in the form of burning logs. And then there were the hearth disputes. These were some of the finest dramas of early history. Who sat closest to the flames wasn't just a preference. It occasionally bordered on philosophy. Whole seconds of silence could pass before someone finally insisted they were too cold to function and nudged their way forward, igniting, pardon the pun, yet another 3-hour conversation about priorities and foot space. Clothing, too, became a central player in this winter theatre. Most people wore all of it, at once. Layers upon layers of wool, linen, scrap fur, and if you were lucky or cunning, someone else's hand-me-down cloak. There are documented cases of people refusing to undress for bed for entire months, out of the simple logic that getting dressed again in the morning was a betrayal of spirit, which frankly should be on a pillow somewhere. Even in larger towns, with their fortified stone walls and more refined craftspeople, winter reduced the rhythm of life to a slow, cold shuffle. Markets thinned out. Artisans took longer naps between professions. And city officials enforced curfews, not because of crime, necessarily, but because wandering around after dark in the blistering cold suggested you had either a problem or a goat that had escaped in some dramatic fashion. And for those living at the edge of the known world, on windswept moors, in wooden huts built with more hope than insulation, winter was less a season and more of a prolonged argument with the elements that no one ever really won. Survival wasn't guaranteed, but if you managed it, if you emerged on the other end come spring, slightly thinner, slightly smellier, and slightly more grateful, you were accepted back into the wider circle of society like a conquering hero of small, quiet victories. Still, for those huddled by the fire, eyes closed, listening to the icy wind tug at the shutters like a frustrated ghost, it was often the small things that got them through. The flicker of firelight, the warmth of someone else's elbow, and the promise that spring, however unreliable, would eventually remember to arrive. But before the thaw, winter would offer one final challenge. As temperatures dipped to their cruelest and the night stretched longest, a familiar foe would seize the moment to pay a visit. And no, it wasn't a marauding army. It was, perhaps worse. Let us wander there, slowly, together. Of all the hazards that a long, cold winter could conjure, frostbite, famine, and unreasonably crunchy socks, perhaps none was more quietly petrifying than the silent spectre of isolation. When the snow piled too high and the icy wind grew tired of knocking and simply blew the door open, people in earlier centuries found themselves quite stuck. For peasant families eking out a living in medieval valleys or lonely highlands, winter was less a season and more a long, white imprisonment with turnips. Social interaction, like fresh fruit, was in short supply. If you were lucky, you might have a neighbor within a quick sleigh ride. If not, your only companions for 3 months might be a smirking goat and the sound of your grandfather muttering about the winter of 1348, when the well froze solid and the priest got lost in a snowdrift with the holy wine. Isolation did peculiar things to the psyche. In Scandinavia, there was a word for the deep melancholy that could settle in during the dark months. Kellermörke, literally cellar darkness. That was no poetic flourish. People actually spent large portions of the winter huddled in basements or root cellars. The only parts of a house warm enough to hold some hope of not freezing your eyelashes off. Imagine 15 people, 6 goats, and a mild but persistent mouse problem all living elbow to elbow by candlelight for weeks on end. Family bonding abounded in these times almost forcibly. And let's just say, by spring, a lot of holes were mysteriously found in family portraits. Even kings and queens weren't immune. The lords of glittering palaces fared better than peasants, of course, what with their roaring hearths and treasonous surplus of furs. But even behind stone walls and velvet drapes, winter's seclusion loomed. Lavish court events slowed, travel became treacherous, and nobles were stuck playing chess and misremembering Latin for amusement. Oh, and let's not forget the candles. Candles were everything in winter: light, warmth, even a kind of psychological friend. Yet, making them was a smelly catastrophe. Tallow was the wax of choice if you couldn't afford beeswax, which meant rendering animal fat, which meant your house smelled like damp regret, dinner, and livestock nostalgia all at once. So while the world outside was frozen and still, the minds inside hummed loudly with worry, creativity, and conspiracy, especially when cabin fever turned into full-season madness. One Norwegian folktale tells of a family who became convinced their goat was possessed by a winter demon because it wouldn't stop chewing through the quilt. To be fair, Some things are easier to blame on evil spirits than poor textile taste. Now, those who lived near frozen rivers or lakes had it particularly tricky. Frozen water bodies were often the only roads open during deep winter. With carts stuck and roads lost beneath snowdrifts, the height of a worried nobleman. Rivers became icy highways, their stirring currents hidden beneath inches of glassy lies. And yet, wagons were flown across them with the blind optimism of desperate errands and trusted geometry. A well-known anecdote from 1695 Germany tells of a baker who attempted to cross a frozen river with sacks of flour and his apprentice. 10 feet onto the ice, he decided it was safer to send the apprentice ahead to test the cracks. What happened after that? Well, the apprentice went on to become a swimming instructor rather early in life. Isolation had other, even tastier consequences. Everything had to be preserved, smoked, salted, pickled, or dried, until it tasted either like shame or a delightful accident. Fermented fish, buried cheese, moldy bread that developed charming personalities. Much of this was born from the simple fact that no one could nip down to the market when the streets disappeared. But amidst the solitude and salted everything, humans did what they always do. Adapted, laughed, sung songs to make the silence a little less overwhelming, and carved little suns into wood to remind themselves that eventually, gloriously, spring would arrive, with mud, taxes, and new reasons to complain. And just before sleep takes you into its own soft snowdrifts, imagine the gentle sound of hooves on ice, distant singing through the frost, and a quiet fire crackling while the world patiently waits to thaw. Soon enough, we'll tiptoe into the curious cottage of old weather superstitions, because if winter couldn't be stopped, it could at least be predicted, very incorrectly. The bitter winters of the 18th century brought about many things: crocheted shawls, rosy noses, dramatic sighs over frozen chamber pots, but none caused quite the amount of groaning and gallows humor as the customs surrounding funerals. Now, you might be wondering what funerals of all things have to do with winter. But if you're going to shuffle off the mortal coil, you might want to consider doing it in spring. You see, in centuries past, burials in winter became a logistical nightmare, equal parts macabre and mildly farcical. When the ground froze, as it often did from October to April, it transformed into a substance distinctly uncooperative to the humble shovel. Digging a proper grave in permafrost was less like soft garden work and more like attempting to tunnel through locked marble using spoons. This frigid reality led to some rather inventive solutions. Some villages developed what were called corpse houses. Think of them as cozy, respectably gloomy barns, but for cadavers. Imagine a quaint stone building tucked on the edge of a churchyard with wooden beams and a small iron door, and inside, various dearly departed villagers lying in wait for spring's thaw, bundled up like they're out glamping. They didn't call it the delayed eternal rest plan, but it would have been fitting. In some wealthier areas, these structures were properly ventilated, occasionally chilled with snow to preserve appearances. In less affluent locales, they relied on the natural cold. Makeshift wooden coffins stacked tidily, the mortuary version of an overnight cloakroom. It was respectfully somber and slightly inconvenient. This gave rise to one of history's lesser-known winter taboos. No one really wanted to die after the ground froze, both out of superstition and simple courtesy. Gossip would swirl not only about your demise, but also about whether your family had remembered to salt the path to your temporary resting hut. And imagine, if you will, the springtime ceremony when the earth finally softened, and an entire season's worth of dearly deported were finally laid to proper rest. Local carpenters would have a backlog of coffins to varnish. Gravediggers raced the melting snow, and choirs ran through funeral psalms like they were on loop. It was not uncommon for cemeteries to hold a sort of mass interment schedule, like school picture day, but grim, and with more incense. In some particularly ancient Nordic settlements, families didn't even bother with buildings. The dead were stored in ice caves, often near the village food stores. This led to a rather chilling situation, pun meant, where preserving meat and preserving great-uncle Torbjörn happened in nearly the same location. Okay, practical use of space admittedly, but it made one wonder what kind of label system they used. Hopefully, a very thorough one. Elsewhere, in more southern climate zones with less icy soil but plenty of mud, winter brought a different kind of problem: rampant slipping. Pallbearers often had to navigate icy paths on church grounds, wearing formal shoes with the traction of buttered eels. There are records, humorous in hindsight if not at the time, of mourners tumbling halfway into open graves. Weddings were not the only events to practice the art of catching fainting bridesmaids or tripping over lace hems. And yet, through all this bumpy, frozen mess, people still managed to honor their dead. They adapted, they carried on. They sang, stumbled, and lit candles in the frost. Nothing quite says the resilience of the human spirit like insisting on a dignified funeral in the middle of a blizzard. All told, these icy traditions remind us just how difficult it was to navigate death in a pre-central heating world. Today, we schedule memorials with an outlook based more on availability than geology. But once upon a time, Mother Nature held the final calendar, and she was not accepting rescheduling. Which brings us to another small but frosty conundrum faced during the bitter months. What exactly did our ancestors wear to battle the cold? When wool ran low and fashion met frostbite, that's precisely where we're headed next. As the snow pressed in and the winds howled their winter lullaby across the ancient Baltic lands, one particularly perilous threat snuck into the lives of our medieval ancestors. Not wolves nor warlords, but mold. Yes, mold. The silent, fuzzy tyrant that thrived in damp, enclosed granaries and became the unsuspecting culprit in many a shivering winter's tale. It turns out that storing grains for winter was rather like playing a season-long game of Russian roulette. If your rye had been even slightly moist, it might express its discontent by nurturing a fungus called Claviceps purpurea. This fungal party guest would produce ergot, a substance whose effects, should one be so unlucky as to ingest it, resembled a late-night fever dream crossed with a slow-motion horror movie. Numb limbs, convulsions, hallucinations of biblical proportions, and a burning sensation so intense it earned the nickname St. Anthony's Fire. So not exactly a peaceful winter pastime. Some considered it divine punishment, others witchcraft. Though frankly, if your bread starts making you see glowing deer that whisper tax advice, anyone might be tempted to light a torch and look for someone to blame. In the spirit of misplaced blame, winter was a high season for scapegoats of all kinds. The grind of surviving long, dark months turned neighbor against neighbor and suspicion into sport. Did your livestock freeze unexpectedly? Clearly, it was someone's curse. A child caught a chill and couldn't shake it. Must be the old woman who lives by herself and talks to her chickens. Witch trials, in fact, often spiked around the colder months, not because witches felt a festive urge, but more likely because communities needed a reason for their misfortunes. preferably one that ended with a bonfire. You could say it added warmth in the wrong kind of way. Meanwhile, across the colder reaches of Scandinavia, people honed their tolerance for winter with a strategy equal parts practical and poetic. They embraced the concept of hygge, the Danish-born idea of creating coziness and contentment in every corner of their snowy lives. This varied from lighting an excessive number of candles, a fire hazard in the making, to bundling up with sheepskins, steeped ale, and storytelling so richly exaggerated it could warm your ears. For example, your neighbour might spin a yarn about how during the Great Freeze of 1203, he fought off a frost giant with nothing but a stale meat pie and an oath to Thor. Entire sagas were built this way, passed mouth to mouth like winter-warmed brandy, smoothing over the boredom and bitterness of months where even the goats refused to get out of bed. Speaking of brandy, one must not overlook the truly heroic role alcohol played in winter survival. From mead halls in Northumbria to vodka-fortified huts in Tsarist Russia, the human species has long employed liquid courage to soften the edges of a biting chill. In Moscow, it was customary to clink glasses before every long walk, just in case the cold had sinister intentions. One toast for health, one for the ancestors, and one, just in case, for the Tsar's taxman, who might also be hiding behind a snowdrift. But if mouldy bread and freezing sleigh rides weren't enough, imagine this: no vitamin C. For a large chunk of European history, winter scurvy wasn't just a pirate's problem, it was everyone's. With little access to fresh food, especially anything as tropical as an orange, people's gums receded as dramatically as their hope. Teeth fell out faster than snowflakes, and suspiciously soft knees made staircases a treacherous location for the elderly. To keep up strength, many relied heavily on salted meats, which were more or less the medieval version of winter rations. Tough, chewy, and distressingly grey, this preserved protein-filled bellies but failed to bring much cheer. Still, despite all odds and all risks, our ancestors managed to survive and even occasionally thrive through winter's merciless reign. Their small victories came in many forms: crafting mittens from squirrel pelts, mastering soup, or inventing the slipper. Never underestimate the morale power of warm toes. And perhaps most importantly, they learned the ancient art of waiting. Waiting for the thaw, for the return of sunlight, and for the first green shoot that would pierce the snow like a promise from the earth itself. But as we snuggle deeper into our metaphorical sheepskins and drift through these last icy corridors of the past, a question curls its way into the hearth smoke. What happened when entire towns, entire regions, misread the mood of the weather altogether? When they set off for new lands midwinter, chasing survival but meeting only snowstorms? Don't worry, we're gently approaching that tale now. Somewhere around the 12th century, a monk in a drafty English scriptorium dipped his quill in ink that had frozen stiff inside the pot, exhaled a foggy sigh, and wondered, with saintly patience, whether fingers counted as expendable in the quest for illumination. Across the continent, in stone castles with more windows than glass, nobles bundled beneath 40 pounds of goose feather and marital obligation, nursing chilblains and an ever so lingering suspicion that their feet had long ago stopped being part of their bodies. It was in winter, more than any other season, that the fragility of human ingenuity laid itself bare across the frozen landscape. For all that, civilization had achieved plumbing, plows, plague. The mastery of cold remained forever just 3 layers of wool and prayer away. Food once again, played the starring role in this seasonal drama. By January, peasants in northern Europe were staring down cellars that had grown ominously hollow. Salted pork hung like medieval chandeliers in the icebox of a root cellar, with the occasional patch of questionable fuzz that was either penicillin's rustic cousin or the final test of one's trust in divine protection. If you didn't salt it in October, you simply didn't eat it in February. And even when you did, the salt alone could make your tongue stiff enough to qualify as a wind chime. But the real peril of winter wasn't just hunger, it was isolation. Villages could be cut off by snowdrifts taller than a bowman's ego, and rivers froze solid into stunning yet deeply inconvenient sculptures. If someone broke a leg on a snowy trail, there was little to be done but wrap them in furs, whisper encouragement, and wonder aloud which of the saints handled orthopedic matters. Even monasteries, those hubs of literacy and berry wine, had to make hard choices. Monks who took vows of silence were suddenly very grateful for gestures and eyebrow choreography when it came time to distribute limited bread rations, and for anyone wondering if iced over holy water was still sacramentally effective. Well, the Church has always excelled in creative interpretation. Further north, among the Norse, winter was both lethal and surprisingly well themed. This wasn't merely cold, it was Ragnarok's waiting room. But the Vikings, never ones to waste a good storm, turned the season into an opportunity for indoor storytelling, carving runes and reputations in equal measure. The longhouse was more than shelter, it was a memory vessel. Stories passed from toothless drooling crones to wide-eyed children by the fire. Half of them true, all of them terrifying if you were lucky enough to be royalty during these freezing months. Your challenges were less about surviving the cold and more about surviving your own relatives. Cold weather meant nobles piled into the same castles, fires roaring no matter how stuffy the room, and idle hands steadily becoming the devil's administrative staff. Winter plots were not just farm-related. They were often whispered near the hearth, between games of chess and goblets of heated wine that tasted slightly of desperation and cloves. In some regions, civic leaders cleverly tried to soften the existential threat of January by turning it into a party. Enter the tradition of winter festivals, midwinter feasts, solstice rituals, and drunken masquerades where the frozen world outside was forgotten for a night, and the wine made everyone unbearably philosophical. Even the architecture, particularly in Eastern Europe, had a kind of grudging respect for winter carved into its bones. Homes were built half into the earth for insulation. Livestock were kept indoors, occasionally sharing rooms with humans, so that the line between farmstead and family became very blurry indeed. And then there were the plague winters, those particularly ill-fated years when snow and disease shook hands. There is something uniquely harrowing about watching white flakes coat a city square while the bells toll for those who've fallen ill. Still, there was a quiet bravery to how people continued, lighting candles, singing hymns, boiling everything in sight, including, in some cases, their ale. But in the cracks of all that hardship, there was resilience. For every gust of wind that rattled wooden shutters, there was a pot of something vaguely edible bubbling over a hearth. For every frostbitten morning, there was the slow, stubborn whisper of spring buried under the snow, waiting its turn. Which leaves us with one final question. The last glimmer of curiosity before we, too, delve into our own slumber. After all, this chilling chaos, how did early societies emerge stronger from the ice? What lessons, thawed over centuries, did winter etch into the soul of humankind? But for now, let the fire crackle and soften the edges of your thoughts. History sleeps too, you know, and tomorrow will uncover its final winter breath. And so, with a low sputtering candle and the last of the wood crackling in the hearth, let us wander one final time through the frost-laced corridors of the past. Across the ages, winter has stalked history not just with icy breath, but with a curious sense of theatrical flair. It's as if the season insisted on arriving not merely to drop temperatures and lose everyone's goats, but to test the very definition of human refusal. You see, early humans, bless their woolly boots and dramatic instincts, did not take winter lightly. No, they braced for it with the sort of existential dread you might reserve today for tax season, or when the Wi-Fi blinks out during a show's cliffhanger. Take the medieval peasants of Europe, for instance. Winter was their final exam for the year, except instead of studying, they had to hope their preserved turnips didn't ferment into something dangerous. Sourdough was a controlled risk. A rotting cabbage was an act of culinary defiance. The communal larder was both a pantry and a suspense novel. Was there still salted pork at the back? Had the root cellar flooded again? Did the ale freeze into a medieval slushy? As winter set upon them, life became a careful ballet of do not die. Fires had to be stoked constantly, yet firewood was scarcer than honesty in a pirate's autobiography. You'd send one poor lad out with a hatchet and hope he came back with logs, and ideally, both his ears still attached. Frostbite, after all, was the season's signature souvenir. The rich, meanwhile, fared better. But even in a toasty keep with tapestries and 6 puddings, winter had its own opinions. Castles were notoriously draughty, with wind whistling through arrow slits like medieval ASMR. Royal derrieres were seated cautiously above chamber pots that steamed like tiny, tragic geysers. Even kings couldn't escape the reality that their beard might freeze to their goblet if they toasted too energetically. Farther east, in the Siberian plains, winter didn't so much arrive as it declared hostile takeover. The Yakuts, ingenious as they were frozen, crafted boots from layered felt called valenki, allowing them to toddle elegantly across icy landscapes like minor, fur-swaddled gods. But even they had to time their nose-blowing activities carefully, lest the results become icicles mid-flight. Across continents, humans leaned into their creativity. Inuit families built snow houses, what you might know as igloos, with such skill that their interiors could reach a snug 60 degrees, 16 degrees, from just body heat and a tiny oil lamp, which is impressive considering the rest of us can't even figure out how to get our thermostats to stop blinking hold. In Japan, snow temples were constructed not just for warmth but beauty, snow being purified and molded into delicate forms. Meanwhile, in Tang Dynasty China, nobles imported ice to preserve peaches, inventing the cold dessert centuries before the French made a fuss over sorbet. History, it seems, is full of frosty flexes. Of course, the psychological toll of winter was just as nippy. Long nights meant long thoughts. People told tales of witches, hungry wolves, spirits that whistled down chimneys. It wasn't just for storytelling's sake. These myths were, in their own way, how folks made sense of that particular kind of cold that rattles bones and creeps into dreams. And that brings us here, curled in comfort, lit only by echoes and the soft creaking of the past. The ancients have made their peace with the cold, with some failing spectacularly, and others defying frost in style. But all of them knitted their courage and cabbage, and carried the flame, quite literally, of human endurance. Tonight, You rest beneath quilts that never froze mid-stitch, beside heaters that require neither fire-starting skills nor the bravery of venturing outdoors. Toasted toes, a soft pillow, and the calming reminder that winter is tamed now, at least mostly. Perhaps history is not about heroics or conquest, but simply finding a way to stay warm. And with that, let the frost fade. Let your breaths grow slower, deeper, like drifts settling over the landscape of your mind. History may be cold, but here, now, everything is gentle, steady, and warmly forgotten. Sleep well, traveller of time. The snow no longer bites. The night holds no siege. Only the calm hush of distant centuries and the quiet crackling of dreams remain.